Picture this: a young boy, barefoot, working 12-hour shifts in a dark, dusty cotton mill. His hands are raw, his stomach empty, and every clang of the factory bell reminds him that life doesn't pause for the poor. That boy's name was Andrew Carnegie, and one day he'd become the richest man on earth. Born in Scotland in 1835, Carnegie's family knew only struggle. They lived in a single room above a weaver's shop, where every winter felt like a punishment. When machines took over his father's job, the Carnegies lost everything. With little more than hope, they boarded a ship to America, chasing a dream that most immigrants never found. In Pittsburgh, young Andrew worked wherever he could, first as a bobbin boy in a textile factory, then as a telegraph messenger, learning to recognize people's voices before they even spoke. He devoured every book he could borrow from a kind local man who opened his private library to working boys, a small act of generosity that would later shape Carnegie's entire philosophy. But here's where things get interesting. While most people worked to survive, Carnegie studied how others got rich. He noticed patterns: who had power, who controlled the flow of information, and who owned the means of production. By his early 20s, he wasn't just another worker. He was planning his escape from poverty. And escape he did. Through sheer ambition, brilliant timing, and some would say ruthless strategy, Carnegie transformed himself from a telegraph boy into a steel magnate who could outproduce entire nations. By the time he sold his company to J.P. Morgan in 1901, his fortune was worth the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars today. But here's the part that history books often soften. Carnegie's rise wasn't just about hard work or genius. It was about control, monopolies, and crushing competition, sometimes literally. His empire was built on the backs of men who worked 12-hour days for starvation wages, under conditions so brutal that some never made it home. And yet, this same man would spend the rest of his life giving away nearly all his fortune, building over 2,500 libraries, founding universities, and preaching that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. So which was the real Andrew Carnegie? The ruthless industrialist who broke unions and ruled the steel industry with an iron fist? Or the visionary philanthropist who believed the wealthy had a moral duty to uplift society? That's the story we're diving into. A story of ambition and contradiction, of a man who built an empire of steel, only to spend his final years trying to melt the guilt away. Because behind the polished image of the world's richest man lies a question that still echoes today. Can a fortune built on exploitation ever truly buy redemption? Long before Andrew Carnegie became a symbol of American success, he was just a frightened boy staring out at the gray Scottish sea. He was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, a small town that once thrived on hand-loom weaving. But by the time Andrew was old enough to remember, the Industrial Revolution had already swept through Europe and wiped out his family's only source of income. His father, William Carnegie, was a proud weaver, the kind who believed craftsmanship was an art. But machines didn't care about pride. They were faster, cheaper, and relentless. Within a few years, the Carnegies went from self-sufficient artisans to desperate survivors. And it wasn't just the economy that broke them. It was the humiliation of being left behind by progress. Andrew's mother, Margaret, became the family's backbone. She sold food, mended shoes, did whatever it took to keep them alive. Meanwhile, Andrew watched the world around him change, the old ways dying, and a new, harsher kind of world rising in its place. When he was 12, his parents made a decision that would define the rest of his life. They would leave everything behind and sail to America. It wasn't a romantic journey, it was survival. The voyage was rough, The ship cramped, the future uncertain. But in the Carnegie's minds, even the unknown was better than starving in Scotland. When they arrived in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, reality hit hard. Their American dream turned out to be a cramped room in a dirty industrial city, surrounded by smoke, noise, and poverty. Andrew's father found little work, and soon the family relied on Margaret's earnings from sewing and selling food door to door. At just 13 years old, Andrew went to work in a cotton factory for $1.20 a week. The air was thick with lint, the machines deafening. He'd run up and down the floors carrying bobbins until his feet bled. It wasn't a life, it was endurance. But even then, something about him was different. Where others accepted their fate, Andrew started looking for cracks in the system, tiny chances to climb. He noticed that the telegraph boys downtown looked sharper, talked smoother, and somehow always knew what was happening before anyone else. He wanted that job. When he finally got hired as a messenger boy, he didn't waste a second. He memorized every street, every businessman, every name on every envelope. Soon, he was delivering more than messages, he was absorbing information. He learned which railroads were expanding, who was investing, and which companies were failing. Knowledge became his new currency. And one day, when he learned to operate the telegraph machine itself, his life took a turn. Suddenly, he wasn't just a boy running errands, he was the link that connected powerful men. And powerful men noticed him. Among them was Thomas A. Scott, a rising figure in the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. Scott saw in Carnegie a spark that most workers didn't have: hunger, focus, and a terrifying kind of ambition. He hired Andrew as his assistant, setting the stage for everything that would follow. Carnegie didn't know it yet, but this was the first rung on the ladder that would take him from the factory floor to the heights of American industry. But what he would learn next, about money, opportunity, and the true price of success, would change him forever. By his early 20s, Andrew Carnegie had already climbed higher than most immigrants ever dreamed of. From a messenger boy in dirty boots, he had become the personal assistant to one of the most powerful men in the Pennsylvania Railroad, Thomas A. Scott. It was more than a job. It was an education in capitalism itself. Scott taught Carnegie the unwritten rules of the industrial age, how to manage people, read markets, and spot opportunity where others saw chaos. But more importantly, Carnegie learned that information was power. Every telegram that crossed his desk was a piece of intelligence about the growing world of business. He absorbed it all. Railroads weren't just moving goods, they were moving money. They connected cities, industries, and futures. And Andrew realized that whoever controlled the infrastructure of America controlled its destiny. So he started investing. Carefully at first, small shares in railway companies, bridge projects, and ironworks. Every paycheck he put a little aside, always watching for his next move. And then came his first real fortune, the Keystone Bridge Company. It was a brilliant idea. Replace the old wooden bridges of America's railroads with stronger iron ones. It was risky, innovative, and exactly the kind of project that scared away cautious investors. But not Carnegie. He saw it as inevitable. As the years passed, the young immigrant from Scotland became a rising force in American industry. By his 30s, he was no longer working for the railroad, he was building what the railroad needed. But beneath the success was something darker, an unrelenting fear of falling back into poverty. Carnegie never forgot what hunger felt like, and that fear drove him harder than any ambition could. He worked obsessively, expanding his investments, cutting costs, and reinvesting every profit into new ventures. And then came steel. In the 1860s, a new process from Britain, the Bessemer process, made it possible to produce steel faster and cheaper than ever before. While most American investors hesitated, Carnegie saw the future in molten metal. He once said, "Watch the costs
and the profits will take care of themselves. That line became his religion. He built the Edgar Thomson Steel Works outside Pittsburgh, named after a railroad executive, a clever political move that ensured constant demand. Soon, Carnegie's mills were running day and night, feeding America's hunger for railroads, skyscrapers, and machinery. But this wasn't just business. It was empire building. Carnegie didn't just produce steel. He controlled every step of the process, from the iron ore mines to the railroads that delivered it, even to the ships that carried it. He owned it all. This strategy, called vertical integration, made his company untouchable. By the 1880s, Carnegie Steel was producing more metal than any company in the world. Cities like New York and Chicago were literally rising on the backbone of his empire. And yet behind every ton of steel was sweat, smoke, and exhaustion. Workers labored 12-hour days, 7 days a week, often for wages so low they couldn't afford the very rail fares their steel made possible. Carnegie liked to present himself as a friend of the worker, an immigrant who understood their struggle. But his success depended on keeping costs down, and costs, in the industrial language of the time, meant people. Still, for now, the newspapers called him a genius. The government called him a patriot. By the late 1880s, Andrew Carnegie had become more than an entrepreneur. He was an institution. His name was synonymous with progress. His mills glowed like volcanoes on the edges of Pittsburgh, their chimneys painting the sky black with the smoke of ambition. America was booming, and steel was its heartbeat. Every bridge, every rail, every skyscraper owed something to Carnegie's empire. And he knew it. He liked to describe himself as a builder, not just of metal, but of a new America. But while the newspapers praised his vision, few dared to ask what it really took to keep those furnaces burning. Inside his mills, the world looked different. Workers labored in unbearable heat, surrounded by noise and danger. Steel melted at over 2,500 degrees, and one mistake could mean death. Men lost fingers, hands, and sometimes their lives, all to keep production non-stop. Carnegie believed that efficiency was everything. Machines didn't rest, and neither did the men who ran them. Wages were cut whenever profits dipped. Breaks were rare. Injuries were common. But the company line was clear. If you didn't like it, someone else would take your place by morning. It was industrial Darwinism, survival of the cheapest. Yet Carnegie himself, sitting in his mansion or traveling Europe, often wrote about peace, education, and the moral duty of the wealthy. He told the press he wanted to make his workers partners in prosperity. It was the perfect story, a self-made man now guiding others toward a better life. But in truth, his empire thrived on one principle: control everything. Carnegie owned the iron ore mines that fed his mills, the railroads that shipped his steel, and the factories that shaped it. His competitors couldn't keep up. One by one, they either joined him or disappeared. He wasn't just leading an industry, he was building a monopoly. And the more power he gained, the more ruthless his system became. His managers enforced strict quotas. Miss a target, and you'd be replaced by morning. Complain, and you'd be blacklisted from every steel mill in the region. To outsiders, Carnegie was proof that America's promise worked, the immigrant who made it big. But to his workers, he was becoming something else entirely, a distant ruler, rich beyond imagination, whose kindness ended at the factory gates. Still, Carnegie's public image shone bright. He wrote essays about human progress, gave speeches on world peace, and mingled with politicians and intellectuals. He cultivated the reputation of a thinker, a moral industrialist. But behind that polished smile, something dangerous was brewing. A storm of resentment was building in his own steel mills. The workers, tired of broken promises and impossible hours, were preparing to fight back. And when they finally did, the clash would shatter Carnegie's image and stain his legacy forever. because the man who preached equality and compassion would soon be tied to one of the bloodiest labor conflicts in American history.
Summer 1892. The town of Homestead, Pennsylvania, home to one of Carnegie's most profitable steel plants, was about to become a battlefield. For years, workers there had been pushing back against brutal conditions. 12-hour days, 7-day weeks, and constant wage cuts had pushed them to the edge. But Homestead was no ordinary factory. It was the beating heart of Carnegie Steel, and the men who worked there believed they deserved a voice in how it was run. Carnegie, meanwhile, was enjoying the comfort of his Scottish estate. Publicly, he spoke of brotherhood and harmony between labor and management. Privately, he had left one man in charge, Henry Clay Frick. Frick was everything Carnegie pretended not to be: cold, ruthless, and unflinching. His job was simple: crush the union. When the workers' contract expired, Frick refused to negotiate. Instead, he built a massive fence topped with barbed wire around the mill and hired 300 armed Pinkerton agents to take control of the property. The message was clear: the workers weren't partners. They were replaceable. On July 6th, the Pinkertons arrived by barge under the cover of darkness, but the workers were waiting. Word had spread, and thousands of townspeople gathered along the riverbank. The air was thick with anger. When the barges tried to land, shots rang out. No one knows who fired first, but what followed was chaos, a 12-hour gunfight that turned the river red. Dozens were injured, and several men died on both sides. The workers eventually forced the Pinkertons to surrender, parading them through the streets as the crowd jeered. For a brief moment, it looked like labor had won. But victory was short-lived. The governor sent in the state militia, 8,000 armed soldiers, to take back the town. Within days, the strike was crushed, the union dissolved, and hundreds of men were blacklisted from ever working in steel again. And where was Andrew Carnegie? Still in Scotland, sending polite telegrams expressing regret over the violence. To the public, it was hypocrisy at its finest. The same man who spoke of moral duty and human progress had allowed his empire to be defended with bullets. Newspapers called it a massacre. Workers called it betrayal. Carnegie tried to distance himself, claiming Frick had gone too far. But to many, that excuse rang hollow. Frick was doing exactly what Carnegie's system demanded: cutting costs, silencing dissent, and protecting profits at any cost. The Homestead strike didn't just expose the dark side of industrial capitalism. It shattered the illusion of Carnegie's benevolence. From that point on, his name would carry a shadow. To the rich, he was still a visionary titan. To the poor, he was just another man who preached virtue, but practiced greed. And maybe that's what finally pushed him toward the next phase of his life. Not one of power, but of penance. Because after Homestead, Carnegie didn't just want to be rich. He wanted to be forgiven. By the end of the 1890s, Andrew Carnegie had conquered American industry. His steel empire stretched from the mines of Minnesota to the mills of Pittsburgh, and his railroads carried more wealth in a week than most nations did in a year. He had outlasted competitors, silenced unions, and mastered efficiency to an art. But now, something was changing. The same man who once lived for expansion was starting to think about escape. Carnegie was in his 60s. His public image was still stained by the Homestead strike, and deep down, he knew the world saw him differently now. The once admired immigrant hero had become the face of industrial greed, and though he never said it aloud, it haunted him. That's when a man named J.P. Morgan came calling. Morgan was America's most powerful banker, a man who didn't just finance industries but owned them through sheer influence. His dream was to unite the scattered giants of steel under one colossal company that could dominate the world. But to make it work, he needed Carnegie. At first, Carnegie wasn't interested. He had no intention of giving up control of the empire he'd built from nothing. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He had already won.
He had proven his worth. Maybe it was time to cash out and rewrite his story. One evening in 1900, Carnegie took out a piece of paper and wrote down the number he would sell for. It was staggering, $480 million, roughly $16 billion today. He handed it to a messenger and told him to deliver it to Morgan. Morgan looked at the note, smiled, and said 4 words. "Congratulations, Mr. Carnegie. You are now the richest man in the world." Just like that, Carnegie's career in steel was over. He sold his company, lock, stock, and furnace, and walked away wealthier than any man alive. But money wasn't what he wanted anymore. What he craved was something no fortune could buy: redemption. He once wrote, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." And now with his wealth secured, he set out to prove it. He began giving away his fortune on a scale the world had never seen. He funded universities, scientific research, and peace initiatives. But what captured his heart most were libraries. He remembered that kind Scottish man who once let him borrow books when he was a poor telegraph boy, and he decided to pass that gift forward. By the time he was done, Carnegie had funded over 2,500 public libraries across the globe. To him, this was justice. To others, it looked like guilt. Critics said he was trying to cleanse his conscience, building libraries for men whose fathers had died in his mills. Supporters said he was a visionary, a man who believed knowledge, not charity, was the true path to progress. Either way, his transformation from ruthless industrialist to global philanthropist was complete. But even as the world applauded his generosity, Carnegie's own past refused to stay silent. Because no matter how many libraries he built, no matter how many scholarships he funded, the question remained: could a man who built his empire on suffering ever truly buy forgiveness?
After selling his empire, Andrew Carnegie didn't just disappear into luxury. He turned his attention to something far bigger than business, an idea that he believed could reshape society itself. In 1889, years before he retired, Carnegie had written an essay called The Gospel of Wealth. It wasn't just a pamphlet about charity. It was a declaration of philosophy. He argued that wealth was not meant to be hoarded or inherited, but used for the public good. The man who dies rich, he wrote, dies disgraced. It was a powerful message, especially coming from the richest man on earth. But the Gospel of Wealth wasn't about simple generosity. Carnegie didn't believe in handouts or pity. He believed in opportunity. To him, giving meant empowering people to rise on their own, the same way he had. Libraries, schools, and universities, those were his temples. They didn't feed the poor. They taught them how to climb. Over the next 2 decades, he gave away roughly 90% of his fortune, the equivalent of billions of dollars today. He built Carnegie Hall in New York, founded the Carnegie Institution for Science, created the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and poured his wealth into education and research. Everywhere you went, his name became a symbol of knowledge and culture. In many ways, it was the legacy he had always wanted, a story of progress, not profit. But there was another side to it, one that his critics never let him forget. While Carnegie built monuments to learning, the men who had built his empire were still living in poverty. Many of them never saw a single benefit from his generosity. Some of their children worked in the same dangerous factories that had made him rich. To those families, a library wasn't salvation, it was irony. As one worker reportedly said, "We have no time to read after 12 hours in the mill." Carnegie believed he had done his duty, but to many, his gospel of wealth sounded less like compassion and more like justification. It was a philosophy that said, yes, I built an empire on your labor, but I'll use the profits to make your grandchildren's lives better. Still, in his mind, that was the highest form of morality, to give back not by equalizing wealth, but by spreading opportunity. He truly believed he was repairing the world. And yet, as he grew older, the contradiction that defined his life became impossible to ignore. He had once ruled an empire built on steel and sweat. Now he ruled an empire of libraries and ideals. But deep down, he knew that the two were forever connected. One had built the other. And while his money could fund education, research, and peace, there were some things it could never erase. The echoes of strikes, the smoke of Homestead, and the memories of men who never got to share the dream he created. Still, Carnegie pressed on, determined to end his life not as a tycoon, but as a teacher. He wanted to prove that wealth could be a tool for progress, not just power. And that belief would shape not only his final years, but the way the world views philanthropy to this day. When Andrew Carnegie died in 1919, he wasn't remembered as a man of steel. He was remembered as a man of ideas. By the time of his death, he had given away over $350 million, nearly all of his fortune. He built over 2,500 libraries, funded universities, and created foundations that still exist more than a century later. And yet, his name remains one of the most complicated in American history. To some, he was the embodiment of the American dream, the poor immigrant boy who rose from a $1.20 a week job to become the richest man alive, a man who proved that hard work and ambition could rewrite destiny itself. But to others, he was the symbol of capitalism's contradictions, a man who preached kindness while his empire crushed unions, who built libraries for workers but fought their strikes with armed guards. His story forces us to ask a difficult question. Can a fortune built on hardship ever be redeemed by generosity? Carnegie himself struggled with that question. In his final years, he often spoke of peace, not just between nations, but between classes. He dreamed of a world where wealth and labor could exist in harmony, where industry served humanity instead of exploiting it. He even helped fund peace movements during World War I, believing that the same ingenuity that built steel could one day build understanding. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The war he tried to stop became one of the bloodiest in human history, and the modern age that his steel made possible, skyscrapers, railways, battleships, was also an age of destruction on a scale the world had never seen. Still, his impact can't be denied. Every library with his name, every scholarship he funded, every student who learned to dream bigger because of his institutions, they're all part of the empire he left behind. Not an empire of metal and machines, but of minds. Today we remember Andrew Carnegie not as a saint, and not as a villain, but as a paradox. A man who proved that ambition can lift you to the heavens and also weigh you down with guilt. A man who conquered the world of industry only to spend the rest of his life trying to give it back. He started as a boy in a smoky factory staring at molten steel and ended as a philosopher, trying to forge humanity's conscience. And in the end, his greatest creation wasn't the steel that built America's cities. It was the idea that wealth in the right hands could build something far greater than any empire. A legacy.